Okay, well, bit of introduction really from me. Over the last couple of years I've seen some excellent presentations in this room since I joined the PMPDP programme, for which I'm currently at the dissertation stage. It's my pleasure to be here to speak to you all, and a little bit about my role in AMEC for those of you who don't know me. I'm head of function for project controls in AMEC Power and Process Europe, which is one of AMEC's divisions. My operational responsibilities include rolling out an implementation of integrated project management procedures and systems, which have recently included involvement in standard project management methodologies, but also global rollout in AMEC of Primavera P6 planning and scheduling software application, and a complete suite of planning and scheduling and project control procedures that have been used across AMEC globally. Operationally, I also conduct project management governance reviews, peer assists, audits of projects and programs. I currently lead AMEC's project control planning and scheduling team, and I'm a member of the global project controls team as well. AMEC also has its own academy, and I do some lectures in the AMEC Academy on project controls. Outside of AMEC, I'm actually involved with a number of industry organisations, because one of the biggest problems, not the subject of today's lecture, that I encountered 20 years ago becoming a manager was the shortage of skilled practitioners in planning and scheduling. So I'm involved as a Vice President with the Association of Cost Engineers, but working with other organisations, notably the ECITB, and have been for about 12 years in developing national occupational standards for project controls, accreditation. We've got tiered accreditation through to something resembling chartership, and graduate and apprentice programs. A little bit about AMEC as well before we get into the main body and subject area of the presentation. AMEC originated 160 years ago as a UK construction company, grown by acquisition to become one of the largest leading engineering, procurement, project management and consultancy companies in the world. We've become, importantly as a milestone in our history, in December 2007, FTSE 100 company. AMEC employ almost 30,000 people around the world in 40 countries. Half of the organisation roughly based in the Americas, towards half in the UK. And we work in four main sectors, which you can see on this slide. The bit of AMEC that I work in is the clean energy sector with Power and Process Europe, which has the subsectors that you see, the four subsectors under clean energy on the top right of the slide. So looking at those subsectors fairly quickly, nuclear subsector is our largest, and we're involved in the programme management of complex nuclear assets. That includes new build, where we have an architect engineer role on Hinkley for EDF. It includes refurbishment and prolonging the life of existing nuclear power stations such as Hartlepool, Heysham, Sizewell. Reactor support, where a lot of consultancy work is involved. And at the other end of the situation, we've got operational support in clean-up, decommissioning and waste management. We're also involved in a nuclear management partnership with two of the main players in Sellafield. The renewables, bioprocess, power and transmission and distribution are our other three sectors. What I've highlighted on here is really the details of a project in each of those sectors. Basically, in renewables, we provide detailed design, engineering and construction management services related to sustainable power generation, which includes wind, solar, biomass, energy from waste, hydrogen fuel cells, carbon capture and carbon storage. And in power, we deal with conventional power stations, that's the old coal and gas power stations, and that involves cleaning them up environmentally. So we've fairly recently completed 3 flue gas desulfurization projects, and we're currently working on Probably the largest, well, it is the largest construction project of its type in the UK, West Burton CCGT power station, peak labour force you see of 2,000 there. That project, which has been going for 3 years, will complete at the end of this year. Transmission and distribution is where we maintain the infrastructure and distribution for the electricity supply in the UK. One of the key projects being the M1 Corridor Alliance, which is based in the sort of North Midlands predominantly. So on to today's lecture, and the agenda gives you an idea of the items that I'm going to go through, but a little bit about this lecture before we get into it. I think PMPDP proved its value when I did Module 3 about 18 months ago. This lecture you're seeing today started out as a 5-minute assignment on Module 1, on Module 3, planning and scheduling. And then it grew into a second 5-minute assignment. It then grew again into a 2-hour presentation. I've actually presented a full 2 hours on this topic to 300 students, full-time students here in Project Management and Civil Engineering. That's 3 separate lectures. So now today I'm bringing it back to an hour, to deliver it in an hour by reducing it a little. And I'm also presenting very much this presentation next week at an international project management conference for the energy industry in London. So to get us all on the same page, I think it would be good for us to get an appreciation together of what we mean by technical integrity in the context of the project schedule. I sort of came up with a phrase about 2003, working with another company, not AMEC, and reflectively for this lecture I've looked back at what does technical integrity mean, because when I first used the phrase it had been used for things like the properties of material and structures, so it's more of a design calculation type phrase. So looking at the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, technical word relates to a particular subject, art or craft and its techniques. And I would maintain that network analysis, for those of you who've studied that or looked at it, is in itself, it meets all those criteria in terms of being it's a craft, it's an art and it's a technique. Integrity is the condition of being unified or sound in construction. Well, as we're going to go through today, what I hope I'll be highlighting is that if the network, the project network isn't sound in the way it's been put together, then it hasn't got integrity. Other than the Oxford Dictionary, Max Weidman, the website's at the bottom, has a very comprehensive project management dictionary which might be of use to some of you. And he defines the technical side as the application of specific principles and reasoning to the resolution of project management problems. And again, producing a network, critical path analysis, they're all practices and principles that aim to resolve project management problems and issues, ultimately with the aim of completing on time of the projects. And again, integrity, Max Weidman talks about dealing with the parties' firm adherence to a code of moral values, completeness, honesty, forthrightness, straightforwardness and entirety. And again, project network needs to be an honest statement of an intent to plan and deliver a project, and it needs to cover the entire scope of the project that's been undertaken. So, how big is the problem? I'm maintaining that there is a problem through my actual professional experience. There is a problem with project schedules. They don't always do their job and meet the objectives of helping complete a project on time. And in fact, 4 experts from the PMI back in 2003, who go back to the early 60s when not long after the whole network analysis process started, met together in the States. They were very concerned actually about the introduction of computer software for project scheduling. In particular, they were concerned about Primavera, and they believe that it has transformed the whole process of network analysis and scheduling into something that wasn't working. The functionality of the software, they believe, was leading to abuse of the process by inexperienced planning engineers when they were preparing project networks in the computer. And they described it as rotten bananas in a software paradise. I nearly put that on the front, and you'd have thought, what's he got bananas on the front of the presentation for? But that was what they concluded in a descriptive way was the problem. And the quote, there's three parts to this quote, so I'll just bring them up, and if you just like to read what they were saying, and I don't know if some of this will ring home to any of you in your work experience. Any of that feel familiar at all? Yeah? So they were having a go at Primavera, in particular, whose president, Primavera's president Dick Ferris, said that software vendors such as Primavera who develop software aren't responsible for abuses in the use of the software, in the same way that spreadsheets developed by the likes of Microsoft, Excel notably, of course, that isn't responsible for faulty accounting. What Dick Ferris did acknowledge, though, was that there were more people doing planning and scheduling, preparing networks than in earlier years, and that certainly training was an issue. So what are the problems in developing project schedules? Problems that I encounter and have done for many years looking at schedules on projects. There are many, but in particular we're going to look at 5 problems today and how to solve them later. So problem of open-ended activities, use of constraint dates, which I'll explain all of these for those who don't know what they mean, negative lags, incorrect software settings, and excessive detail. The first 3 of those problems can override the natural calculations of a critical path from the forward and backward pass. That's early starts, late finishes, float calculations, etc. And the 4th problem, if the software is not set correctly, that actually can have the same sort of effect. It can cause problems and erroneous calculations. The software is actually getting increasingly complex in terms of, if anyone who has seen Primavera's P6 will realize it's quite a complicated tool. So yeah, we'll take a look at the problems, take a look at what issues they cause, take a look at some past examples, and we're going to look at some best practice generally in industry, and also some of the work I've done in AMEC to try and help us improve our own practices as well. So looking at open-ended activities first, there'll be a picture coming up in a minute. Open-ended activities occur actually as a result of decisions or errors by the project planner when creating the project schedule. So if you look at this particular slide, the top slide shows a very small network, but indicatively shows you that the correct approach is to have only 2 open ends. That's the first activity in the network, in this case activity A, and which has no predecessor, and the last activity, activity J, which has no successor. All of the other activities, as you can see, are joined up. And we've got a critical path that runs around the top of the network from the left-hand side through activities A, C, D, E, and J. That's highlighted in red. Imagine this had hundreds of activities, or even thousands as the case may be, but in this particular example, what's happened is that the predecessor, there's no predecessor from to activity C. It's been missed or omitted, and no predecessor to activity F on the bottom half there. So we haven't got a continuous sequence of activities through the network on those parts. And aside from all the calculations, what that actually does is change the critical path, which in this case runs through activities B, A, B, G, H and J. And of course, depending on what those activities were, they may not at all resemble what is critical on the project. We have an incomplete logic situation here. Very easy to spot on a small network. So the next problem that I'd like to move on to is the use of constraint dates. And computerized project management software has various constraint date types which can be assigned to activities as imposed dates. But you have to be very careful if you're going to do that, because first of all, the different types have different impacts, which we'll look at in due course, but also they actually override the natural calculation in network analysis. Certainly that those of you who have done Module 3 or have practical experience of in work will appreciate. And the type of constraints are actually described differently in if we take the two main project management software in use, Primavera and Microsoft Project. They're described differently, but I've just shown there the equivalent constraint types. And they have different levels of severity in the way they impact on the calculation, which again we'll talk about a little bit later on. But just to show the kind of effect that can happen, if we look at an example of using constraints, activity G, which is the one with the yellow flash around it in the bottom left, that has an early start. There's a legend on the bottom right of the slide. That has an early start of day 24 on the top left of the box at the bottom. Yeah. So imagine it's been given a constraint date instead of day 24, which is a natural calculation, it's constrained that it can't start till on or after day 29, which is 5 days after its early start from the network analysis. The question then is, what will happen to the project finish date on activity J? Anybody got an answer for that? Activity J is the one on the right. And the project finish date is the early finish is the top left box, which is 57. Yeah, it'll slip. So it slipped from day 63 on the late. It slipped from 57 to 62 on the late early and 63 to 68 on the late. So you get a 5-day slip in the project analysis. And again, I contest that that's fine, you can see it on here. But if you've got 3,000 activities and you're doing this kind of thing to the network, you've got to be very sure and careful what you're doing. And does the project manager know what's happening? Or does he just look at the bar chart that comes out? And actually, until I looked into this research that I'm doing on my dissertation, I actually thought that this whole problem of constraints and their use and damage started with the computer, with the PC, when it came along in 1983. But I've actually learned that it actually started back in the manual networking days and the days of mainframe computers. So what we have here is an extract from an old style arrow diagram rather than the precedence convention today, the boxes. So that's an extract from, could be the 60s or the 70s, doesn't matter. And there was actually a convention in place. There were actually a couple more, but this is a typical convention. The blue triangles there on the right hand side show constraint dates that have been applied to, there's a not later than constraint. That's the first one on the left, triangle. There's a not earlier than, and there's a required completion date constraint, actually, which doesn't quite figure today. But basically, the manual networks that were drawn up by people in the old days did have a means of constraining the calculations in some cases. What I would maintain, though, is that in those days, more people sat around and got involved with the network that was drawn and the logic, where I see a tendency that the planning engineer puts something together with all the logic in the computer, and the project team see, at best, a linked bar chart, which it's hard to see the logic on anyway. So when the schedule's reviewed, they probably don't know what constraints are in the network and what effect they're having on the calculations. So move on to negative lags. Precedence techniques, precedence diagram method, again part of module 3, allows for lags between activities, dependencies I think they're called in the module course. Relationships is another term we use. Start 5 days, finish 10 days, this kind of thing between activities. But what the software allows is the notion of a negative lag. And I'm going to just pull something up to explain that. This diagram here then. So in this example, a negative lag has been used to say that activity B needs to start 20 days before activity A finishes, which indicates that a future event will dictate the timing of an event in the past. Well, that's a situation that's not really logical or possible. Negative lags can actually compromise Monte Carlo risk analysis, which is increasingly used today to optimize a project schedule and establish the likelihood of reaching the completion date that comes out of the network. But it's a very controversial topic in the planning and scheduling community. Certainly what I find is that planning engineers have very polarized views on whether they should or shouldn't use negative lags. I discovered a journal paper called The Great Negative Lag Debate, which looked into this and produced a kind of for and against statement. But what it did, the paper achieved a certain amount in terms of providing those planners who like using negative lags with some reasons why, and those planners who don't like using negative lags with reasons why not. But it didn't actually come out with a conclusion one way or the other. It left the whole topic open. And what I've also found is that that particular topic isn't covered much in widespread literature at all. But it's a product of computer. That one definitely is a product of the computer tools that we have today. Incorrect software settings I touched on earlier. Very complex in Primavera P6, for instance, and Microsoft Project Server, I think, is they're actually enterprise project management tools now. You don't just have one project, you have multiple projects which have to share common settings. And some of those settings, if anyone's working in a multi-project environment, which can be across a large part of an organization, they need to be aware of what those settings are and what impact they're having on calculations. And we're going to look at that. We're not going to address this one in particular detail, but suffice to say that there's just a few examples there of some of the key settings beyond the scope of this presentation to explain them all. But for example, if you have the wrong activity duration type, or what can happen is you can enter a duration for an activity when you're building a schedule. Naturally, schedules should be resource loaded with man hours and possibly cost. And if in some cases with the wrong setting, if you double the resource loading, the computer will decide to halve the activity duration. And again, if that's happening across the network and you don't know the settings there, the software is controlling what's happening rather than the planning engineer who's building the network. Lastly, in terms of our 5 problem areas, is the problem of excessive detail in the network. And this, I think, is one of the biggest problems historically from day one in network analysis techniques. And we'll cover some examples of where that's really happened later in the real world, but I'll give you one from my experience. One of the most extreme cases was a 30 million pound construction project about 12 years ago. Now the network for that had 15,000 activities. At the time the design hadn't been done. So we did have a document preload ready, so there was a block number of, for instance, piping isometrics and other types of documents, but no detail, design hadn't been done. So in this particular case, the planning engineer introduced an activity for every isometric that was going to be drawn into his network. They were grouped into plant areas. They were all given a duration of 5 days. So all ISOs the same, eh? They were all resource loaded. And they were all logic linked. And actually what we had was, it was more like a to-do list really. So this was a 3-year construction project. And, you know, it just, how can you plan a job on that basis? Completely skipped any notion of work packaging, which would be grouping isometrics into an activity and giving some sort of sensible duration and resourcing to that based on some kind of best guess. And worse still, it took 40 minutes to time analyse or resource schedule the network when you press the button. So that's a particular case. What happened in that particular case when I got involved was we tightened it up and against the will of the planners actually got it down to 2,500 activities work packed. And then the detail can be planned later when you've got the drawings closer to doing the installation or fabrication or whatever. And I did say earlier it's been a problem right from the very start, excessive detail in the project network. The whole essence of critical path methodology started in 1957 with DuPont in the Americas on chemical plants. And in the very first occasion that they trialled networking techniques, newly developed on a £10 million construction project, 6 engineers went into far more detail than expected. They actually repeated that on a subsequent trial on an engineer procure construct project, and again they went into too much detail to the extent that they had to reduce it because the computer processing power of the day couldn't handle 2,200 activities. Early 1960s, the US Air Force, Dinosaur rocket missile program, 250,000 activities. The contractors couldn't understand that. It was planned by the client really. And it had to be simplified. And in the UK, Bristol Aircraft, in the 60s again, ran into difficulties with a 3,000 activity network on Concorde. There was incomplete logic, loops where you didn't conclude the calculation because you got a bit of logic where you kept going around the loop, and incorrect activity numbering. They just got into a complete mess. Sort of problems you get with excessive activity detail, you get problems with the stakeholders. If you think of those people as the sort of executive or senior management level, they look at a schedule, they get overwhelmed by it, they don't understand the plan, they ignore it. It affects the size of the organisation. If you've got a network with too many activities, somewhere you've got to simplify it and you end up with 2 levels of management looking at the whole project and slower decision making because you've got a taller organisation. The planning engineer has to keep everything up to date, so he has to get progress for everything. Some projects have a lot of changes, and if you've got a lot of changes you've got to build them in. And if you're not careful, you soon run into a situation where your progress reports are either inaccurate or late and not doing what they should be doing. And your schedule look ahead, therefore, the future part of the schedule isn't necessarily correct. Work can be abortive. What really happens is that if you plan the detail too early, before you've got the information to plan it, and you're really only guessing, the planner has a kind of Groundhog Day, where he produces a plan, it gets nearer to the time of doing the work, what he produced isn't viable because we've now got the information for what might be happening in 2 months' time to plan it properly, so he has to chuck his schedule in the bin and start again. And certainly the problem is exacerbated, although I mentioned that it's a problem that goes right back to the very start. The use of the personal computer does exacerbate the problem because the processing capacity means that you can put more and more detail into the network and you no longer have to wait 40 minutes for a time analysis pretty well, no matter how big the network is. This kind of situation that I'm illustrating here, you end up with thousands of activities, thousands of logic relationships, thousands of resource assignments, and then you've got updates, changes and forecasts to manage. And at the bottom I've cited a number of sources and studies that confirm this is probably the biggest problem of all. But is it a computer problem? I think that it's really a people problem. I think that there's a natural tendency to go into detail. It feels right. If we've gone into detail, we must have thought about it. But really, how can you plan something 3 years advance in micro detail? I can't think there's anyone in this room knows what they're doing on Wednesday the 8th of August 2016, for example, or 2015. So how can you plan in that detail, you know, with very small duration activities and know that it's right? And there are differences. There's a different approach validly in shutdown planning because you've got maybe a 3-week event, so that naturally gets planned in detail because it's immediate, it's in a short time frame. But on capital projects of significant duration, it just doesn't make sense. So what does a good practice say? Well, until recently, we've obviously got we've got procedures from the American Association of Cost Engineers on planning and scheduling. We've got PMBOK. APM is very brief. The body of knowledge doesn't say too much, actually. And interestingly, the Society of Construction Law brought a protocol in, which is due to the increasing use of the project schedule in delay and disruption claims, which reinforces the importance of those being a valid document, a valid network, because if you haven't got a valid schedule, you could lose your case. But they came up with a protocol as well. First thing to point out is none of those get down to the nitty-gritty of the 5 problems we look at. So we had some practice and some statements and some information, but they didn't get fully down to the detail. Now you remember the 4 guys we were talking about earlier in 2003 who kicked up a bit of a storm? Well, that kind of sparked a whole bunch of practices that really do get down to looking at the detail and do get down to looking at the problems. As you can see, they've come out in the last sort of 3 or 4 years really. Chartered Institute of Building done some great work in their Schedule Integrity Review, which is part of a book of standards. APM Special Interest Group have produced a model. An excellent contribution from the Government Accountability Office in the States. It's available on the web. All these items are referenced, by the way, at the back of this. Really does give lots of good practice. And these all have techniques for managing these problems that we're looking at. And a fairly simplistic approach, which is described as a first step, really, from the Defence Contract Management Agency in the Americas. That's the 14-point schedule assessment. So this is becoming quite a hot topic. And looking at good practice from these documents really that we've just looked at quickly, going to revisit the same issues we've just described, the problems, starting with open ends, for which you've seen the good practice should look something like what we've got on here. And you've got all this to, you'll have all this on Blackboard after the 15th, after I've presented it in London, but basically I've taken the statements on open ends from the practices and actually from AMEC procedures as well. And you can see that open ends are either prohibited, not allowed, prohibited in red, or at the very least, in a couple of cases, they're discouraged. It's a matter of interpretation of the words, but I've took the softer interpretation. Where it says discouraged, you could almost read some of those to be prohibited, but I've took a soft line on the way I've read it. But basically, that confirms the situation on open ends. Constraint dates I mentioned earlier, they have degrees of severity on the way they calculate or impact on the network calculations. And certainly don't ever use mandatory starts because they just ignore logic completely. And you could actually have an activity starting before its predecessor if you put a mandatory start on it, the wrong mandatory start, which cannot make sense. So the general sort of guidance is, you'll see in a minute, is that they're discouraged. Certainly if you use constraints in building a network, or your planning engineer does, you should document them. They should be available in some document so that the project manager or team can be aware that they exist and confirm that they are reasonable to be used. A good trick is always to take them out and analyse the network and see what difference it makes. But basically, if they're going to be used, go for the lowest impact type of constraint possible on that list. And that's kind of along the lines of the guidance that's covered by the various organisations, all of whom discourage. Nobody forbids it. Discourage means there shouldn't be many, and they should be carefully documented and understood. Discourage constraints, yeah? Back to negative lags. We looked at the top half of this picture earlier, and a negative lag doesn't really make a lot of sense as a piece of logic, and better to put lags and leads in to achieve the same effect, the dependency between the activities. And again, a mixture of either prohibited or discouraged. We prohibit them in AMEC because they're important to schedule risk analysis, which we do a lot of on our major projects. That's the particular reason we don't discourage them and we go one step further. But as you can see, and it also ties in with society construction law, so if ever we end up with a dispute, we're on the right side of that. But again, at the very least, discouraged. Level of detail. There's a term, actually the origins of this term are hard to find, but the term rolling wave comes into play for levels of detail, which I'm going to describe on the next slide. The rolling wave method is basically planning in less detail as the time horizon moves further out, and more detail for the immediate work in the next few weeks and months. The other thing to add is that we've actually specified a limit in AMEC of 3,000 activities on a network for a capital project as a guide to try and keep within. We don't want to go to 250,000, as was the case on that dinosaur project. We do end up with some networks that are a little bit excessive, so we've looked at a 3,000 activity limit as a guide that we're trying to bring in, along with the rolling wave method, which this slide actually comes from the Chartered Institute of Builders, one of the practices that came out we saw a couple of slides ago. They call it schedule density, but it means the same thing. It's their term for rolling wave. So what this shows you basically is that the network detail varies according to the have you got the prior information that you need in order to plan in detail is the question first, yeah? And if you have, and you've usually got that for the next few months' work, then you can plan that in full detail, as in the left-hand segment of this picture. But as the time horizon move out, and the likelihood is if you've got less detail, the design may not be done, the equipment may not be finalised, whatever it is, then you plan in a lesser detail until ultimately, perhaps 12 months hence, you're planning in an overview. And as you keep updating the schedule and moving along, and the work that you're looking at is coming towards you, you start to plan it in the high density. So high, medium and low density is what's described on that slide. And it kind of ties in with, I guess most of you are familiar with the idea of planning levels. Levels 1 to 4, we have a level 3 schedule, which probably represents the general execution plan for the job. We'll have a level 5 if we're doing a shutdown. We'll have a level 1, typically a kind of management overview with major milestones. And again, that kind of convention, which is very common, has been for a long time, relates itself quite conveniently to the notion of low, medium and high density on the left. And you see that at the bottom there we get to the 3-month look ahead in this example, which will be planned in full detail because you've got all the information. You know when the materials come in, you've got the design, whatever it is, yeah? But earlier on you're planning in a bit less detail because there's no point. You're going to have to you'd have to revisit it later when you know the delivery dates are firmer, when the designs appeared. I looked at 8 networks in AMEC back in 2009 from 8 projects. Looked at just 3 of the particular issues we've been looking at. All of these fall in a reasonable level of detail mostly. We've only got a couple of, the 3 networks on the left, a bit more than 3,000 activities as it happens, but they're not too scary. And found that all of the networks had open ends, had constraints, had negative lags, and the average situation for those 8 networks on the right was 2,361 activities with 289 open ends, 150 constraints and 81 negative lags. And if you remember what happens on a small network, we saw it earlier, where you have 1 or 2 of those items. Imagine what's happening with 2,300 activities. Does the project manager know that's what's in the plan? I would suggest most often not. And converting that to percentages rather than numbers, and remembering that the DCMA practice, this fairly elementary practice, suggests 5% maximum open ends, 5% maximum constraints, and 5% maximum negative lags. You can see in red where the percentages are over 5%. Actually, all of those networks would fail that particular test. And so we had the procedures to control that. The procedures we've got today were in place back then, but clearly they weren't being observed on these projects. So we needed to do something else. That's just confirming, by the way, that the networks would fail this DCMA test, as I said. But before I go on to what we did, and what I've introduced really, what causes this problem as a whole? What are the causes, or the root causes really, of networks that aren't correct? And a lot of those causes are on the left. Not enough time. The client wants a schedule 8 weeks after project award in the full detail, usually, for 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years. So not enough time, so the planner takes shortcuts, the project team takes shortcuts. They've got to get the schedule out, whether it's right or wrong. Training, experience, garbage in, garbage out, you've all heard about. And those are the kind of impacts coming from those causes. I've seen networks without a critical path. I saw one network and the critical path was the last 3 days of an 18-month project. Start commissioning, complete commissioning. I've seen a network which was constrained throughout, not a logic link in sight. But at the end of the day, you just lose credibility. So, 5-step solution in AMEC. I mentioned we've got the procedures in place, they've been there for some time. So we've got the rules. Step 1. I've also mentioned they're not enough on their own, clearly, because I looked at 8 networks and just picked them at random, and the rules aren't enough. So, introduce the schedule integrity checking process. So now we're getting into the detail. Now I've looked at 5 main areas, but this integrity check looks at 99 items. For example, you could have a % complete without an actual start date. You could have an actual start date in the future, or a forecast finish in the past. Lots of other things. So this checklist looks at these kind of topic areas that are listed there, the logic and constraints, which is a lot of what we focused on, and many other things, which would make this if we looked at all 99, we'd have a week here. And the other thing is that I've seen a lot of schedules go out on email these days. When I started, you actually put them out under a letter. And also on the schedule was a note of any assumptions. It's important that the schedule goes out with a narrative that clarifies assumptions, clarifications, if constraints are used, where and why, what's the critical path, what are the key issues and risks. This does not have to be a book. This could be 3 pages, 2 pages even, on a given project, describing the way the network's put together. And then it just gets updated at each reissue for progress. And everybody understands then the basis of the schedule. It's not open to interpretation anymore. So you've got your rules, you've got your checklist, you do some work with that, which I'm going to show you in a minute. You've got a statement of what the schedule's about. And then you do some risk analysis to confirm that end date, you've got one end date on the schedule. What's the chance you're going to hit it? Well, you have to do some risk analysis. None of that deals with the actual project plan itself. It doesn't talk about the sequence of work. It doesn't talk about how we put the roof on after the walls are up. None of that. That's a practical view from the project team to go along with this look at the actual technique that underpins it. So there has to be a project review of the plan, of course. The content and constructability, or might not be construction, it could be engineering only. Has to be a look at the scope on the plan, and does the flow of activities make sense? And actually, people should have been involved in it. Shouldn't be down to just the planner. He might put the first draft out, but people should be involved in bringing that plan together. So that should be a fairly straightforward step. So at the core of the solution, we've got this schedule integrity audit, which was step 2 after the rules. A summary report is produced, a 1-pager, and basically what you've got behind there are the 99 checklist items under about 8 headings, just in a kind of format style. So that's really the rules and the tools for checking that the schedule is being produced correctly. And the checklist, as I say, guidance notes, findings, recommended actions. So we put our good practice into there and in terms of prompting the reviewers, who should be independent of the project, to look at the network and make sure they're tying back to good practice from our procedures. And we look at the 8 topic areas, and it's items 3, 4, 5 and 8 that we've sort of touched on mostly in today's lecture. Real world results. Project X, rather than tell you which project it was. So back in December 2010, the network had been issued, the schedule, if you like, project schedule. 204 open ends, which was 15% of the activities. 246 constraints, 18%. Negative lags, 2.5%, 2.6. Basically, that wasn't even in as good shape as the 8 projects I looked at earlier. So we put the checking process in. It's an iterative process. The network gets checked, there's a dialogue with the planner, there's some work done by the planner, the network's tightened up, and you end up with a situation on the right where we're getting somewhere towards a more viable network, down towards below 5%. There's still a bit of a problem on constraints. Percentages are a caution, by the way. One bad constraint could ruin a whole network, so that's just the first step. But basically we were getting towards something a lot better in the space of a couple of months. Now, we had a project with a very demanding client. This was a JV alliance, and in this particular case, started out first review, 388 open ends, 13% of the activities weren't fully logic linked. Not too bad on constraints and negative lags. That's on the 9th of November there. Very keen project controls manager on the project with a demanding client, very keen to receive the help in this checking process. And if you look at the right hand side, by the 25th of January, he'd got the network into very good shape, really. Because perfection is not an option. We're not going to get a full set of zeros in there, I don't think. That's really some way to go. But he got the network into a lot of control, and at that level you can investigate and confirm that there's no major effect on your critical path analysis. And what was the reaction from the projects? Well, as you can see there, it was quite favourable. And this is interesting because I actually, when I brought the process in, thought from past experience of doing some of this kind of stuff, you're going to end up in arguments and a blame game, and people are very sensitive about their plans and schedules, and the planner feels he's being criticised personally. But by approaching it in a kind of open way, it does help if the client's driving you, of course. We managed to avoid that blame game kind of situation, and as you can see, got some good responses, and the planners were bought in as well. So the early feedback's pretty good. We're continuing to use the process. We're bringing in apprentices and graduates, training them properly to take care of that. I'd like to bring more of them in, but there are restrictions on budgets, of course. You've got to negotiate. I think the level of checking we do, as we get better networks, we can start to reduce that, as you know the people and the quality of job they do. You don't have to use all 99 checks. You can start to scale that down in some cases. And there's a strong likelihood, bearing in mind all those practices have come out, that the customer's going to come looking for this kind of stuff anyway. So just talking about those practices, I think they'll become commonplace for both customers and contractors in coming years. And there's a whole software industry which is being built on the back of it. One or two of you may have heard of, if there are any planners among you, you've probably heard of Vacuum and Fuse, which does this kind of integrity checking with nice traffic light stuff, but costs you a few grand. And ironically, Primavera, who were adamant not to put this kind of functionality into the software a few years ago, as you saw earlier, have actually built in a schedule integrity checking process in the latest release based on the DCMA 14-point assessment. So it really is coming. If it's not hit you already on your projects, it's coming. I'm coming towards the end now. Earlier this morning, I think I suggested that 50 years after the use of network techniques in planning and scheduling, which remain the predominant approach, the list of project overruns continues to increase. Schedule overruns continue. So you could be forgiven for thinking network analysis hasn't helped improve project performance. Independent Project Analytics are an American benchmarking company in the energy industry, and they've collected data from thousands of projects from owners, from clients in the engineering and construction industry. They were instrumental in providing input to a report some of you may have heard of called Changing to Compete, which is a review of productivity in the UK for the UK government, known as the Gibson Report, if anyone's heard of that. And Changing to Compete identified problems with planning and scheduling, among lots of other areas. Some of the input came from IPA. One of the things they produced is this slide from the research, which shows that from their research, better scheduling and cost estimating methods, we've got cost comes with schedule, leads to better engineering and construction, labour productivity and cost performance. Doesn't necessarily mean we complete on time and budget, but it's better than it would have been. And the other research by the IPA, 50% of projects that use network analysis techniques return an average 14% schedule overrun. That's looking at 500 projects across the world. So that doesn't sound great, 14% overrun. But if you put it in the context of the projects not using network techniques, and by the way, they included in that number projects that had over-constrained networks. They decided that the networks had so many constraints or so much missing logic that they can't be classed as using network techniques because they haven't really got a network. The average schedule overrun and its associated costs, of course, was 26%. So, a little bit encouraging. I spent 30 years trying to make project controls sexy. I'm sure I haven't managed that today. But 30 years trying to find ways of convincing people that it's important. And my challenge to you all today, after this lecture, is if we can improve our project scheduling, perhaps we can improve on this 14% typical schedule overrun and get nearer to meeting our project objectives. That's it. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Well, it's time related in terms of how near is the work. I think we've got that message on rolling wave. Basically what you've got is, you've got to look at it in two contexts. If we talk about an engineer procure construct schedule then, you need a project schedule. You need something that says, this is the whole project. And so you would work pack that, and I would say you're looking at aiming for, procurement activities are going to be quite long anyway. Yeah? If something takes 15 months to supply, and you're not creating a lot of steps, once you've placed a purchase order, you might have a couple of quality checks in the next work date. They'll have long bars, they'll have long activities sometimes, bulk materials. But in terms of construction and in terms of engineering, I would say look for 80% of the activities. You can't be absolute, but on your EPC schedule, look for 80% of the activities to be perhaps no more than, between 1 and 2 months long, which is a couple of period updates. And there will be exceptions, and that's a judgment on the other 20%, yeah? But look to get about 80% in there. But what you've then got is when you're dealing with the detailed planning of the near-term work, you're then into lots of detail. And there's no limits on that. You're down at, if it's a 2-day job and you're erecting a spool on a piece of piping, or you're producing a specific drawings foundation details in the period of a week or less, you're then into detail. But only do that for the foreseeable work that you can scope out, and you've got a good chance you're going to do it on that date. Don't try and do the whole schedule for 3 or 4 or 5 years on that. So it's a rolling wave piece that takes care of that. Well, the changes, the immediate effect, the change control is a very difficult area. We have to meet certain criteria on, for instance, NEC3 contracts now. But again, you need to build your changes around the level of detail that's in the schedule. So you can still reflect the impact of a change more specifically on the near-term stuff and more generally on the, if you have a spec change on piping that affects the whole design of a whole set of activities, you might have the near-term work where you've got a drawing and you know that it's stainless steel, and this spec change is on the stainless steel, so you can model the impact that the work's on hold actually if you've got a spec change, yeah? So it then goes into the longer frame. But the work further on, you've probably got work packs that are maybe 3 months long or something like that, and the impact there is more general. It's a delay to a longer activity, but you take a judgment, and then as that work comes close, you home in on it. So it is really a judgment thing. Balance. It is a balance, yeah. Right, I would maintain that it's better to be somebody independent of the project, because if you give it to the planner who's built the schedule, he's checking his own work. And if you give it to somebody on the project, they've kind of, there's an element there as well. So what you really need is a cadre of suitably experienced planning engineers with enough freedom to visit a project and do a check, and trained in the practice. Yeah?
Do you do that on everyone, no matter what the size of
No, no. You don't do it on... We actually categorise our projects in... we have what we call category 1, 2 and 3 projects. And actually a lot of projects in the nuclear side are design consultancy. They might be 3 weeks of work with somebody's intellectual knowledge. They're producing a report. And you won't go into all that on those. So it really is for the serious projects.